Hola, bienvenidos todos, todas. It's great to have everybody present. This is really exciting, path-breaking work. I'm so honored to be a discussant and to invite conversation about a very important text that I believe is pushing boundaries, conceptual, intellectual, ways of knowing, epistemological, that is very exciting and interesting. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement here at the University of Texas, where I'm at. It is on Indigenous land on Turtle Island. It's the ancestral name for what we call North America. And would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coshara, Caddo, Carrizo Come Crudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche Kickapoo, Lipanapache, Tancawa, and Isleta Sur del Pueblo, and all the American and Indigenous people and communities who have been or have become part of these lands and territories in the United States. So I am also affiliated with Academia Cuautli. It involves a Mexica kind of epistemology and practice with a Calpuli that informs the work that we do at Academia Cuautli, and it really undergirds it. And so you can learn about us at academiacuautli.com. And it's complicated in ways that it should be to take on an indigenous sort of identity in a community, particularly since we have many sangres within ourselves. I myself am Apache and Purepecha, so from different territories of the continent, I contain these sangres and the identities that to some extent that attached to them. And so I want to now thank you, gracias. It's wonderful to have everybody here. I want to just now turn it over for a presentation, after which there will be questions by myself. I would ask people that after the presentations and after my questions of the presenters, then there will be plenty of time for people within this audience to ask their own questions. And not everything will get answered, but at least some will. And you will certainly get informed about what truly is a path-breaking, very exciting, critical, eye-opening text. So with that, I'd like to pass it to my colega, Sue Casun, Dr. Casun.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was a beautiful introduction, and I'm grateful for your mindfulness of the land acknowledgement and your epistemological stances that you bring to your comments on our work here and all of the work that you do. Dr. Iracema Mora Pablo from the Universidad de Guanajuato and I are co-editors on this text that we're presenting. We'll kind of give you a brief introduction, Iracema and myself, about the text, the kind of the why and the how of the book. And then we have 4 chapter presentations out of the text. We'll have Dr. David Martinez Prieto, Dr. Steve Prismas, and Dr. Kathleen Takalaski, who each have very important points of entry. Iracema, are you able to share the PowerPoint from our text?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So this is the text we're presenting, applying Anzalduan Frameworks to understand transnational youth identities, bridging culture, language, and schooling at the US-Mexican border. So there's a few different areas that the text looks at: resistance, language, and identity, schooling on both sides of the border through Anzalduan lenses, and then an extension of theory regarding transnational youth in Anzaldua. So you might be wondering, well, why Anzaldua? And we were having a brief chat with Angela before our session just now. Anzaldua is, I almost want to use the word goddess, when it comes to theory and a fullness of the embodiment of ways of knowing, thinking about ways of knowing, duality, and not thinking about kind of a taken for grantedness of how and why people are. And so we look at all those complexities that Anzaldua merged in her theorizing about queerness, being Chicana, being multilingual, being a border dweller originally from South Texas, being at times deeply marginalized in feminist circles and in the academy at times. And so we see a lot of similarities between her biography and all of these rich, complex ways of knowing and the fascinating research colegas, participants that all of us have engaged with in some extent with Mexican origin youth on both sides of the border. And all of our work in some ways intersects with education. And so because we care so passionately about cómo educar, how to really bring a society, a different kind of un mundo nuevo into being. So we're bridging, just like Anzalduan heavily used this beautiful metaphor of bridge, including the pains and complexities of it. So if you want to go to the next slide, Iracema. If you want to just go ahead and take this one, Iracema.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. And well, as Sue mentioned here, we have the voices of scholars from Mexico and the United States focusing on a topic of extensive interest on both sides of the border. And we have a representation of the North. In terms of Mexico, we have the representation of the North and Central part of Mexico. And in the United States, we have scholars from different parts of the United States. And the main idea was to bring these scholars together to explore the lives of Mexican origin youth. And these authors have investigated transnational youth from both sides of the border, in which we think it adds a richer view of this phenomenon. We aim to recount how the transnational youth navigate different borders, educational, linguistic, cultural, and how they engage or resist their heritage, because we have a great body of participants in this book that you will have the opportunity to hear from some of the authors here. And the stories we find in this book are in English and in Spanish, and this is something that we would like to highlight. We find in text full English translations to no translations at all. And we think that this reflects the bilingualism and translanguaging of our authors and participants' life daily, or as in Anzaldua's words, or as she would argue, we write with an accent to finally legitimate and free our wild tongues.
And I would like to just briefly add, Iracema, thank you, that when Iracema and I were in conversation about bringing the book into reality, we recognized that oftentimes when people had done work, myself included, about transnational origin youth, the research, as much as we tried to enflesh the people we had worked with, it still came off kind of two-dimensional. And that's where Anzaldua kind of became a necessity to really center and complicate the humanity that these deeply thoughtful, fabulous participants engaged, spanning borders, with skill sets that people pay lots of money to learn how to do, like when they go to college, to learn how to be cultural ambassadors or become multilingual. And, almost always all the participants in our studies had high levels of multiculturalism, if not also multilingualism. So Iracema, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. And well, here, first of all, we would like to thank Professor Angela Valenzuela for her insights and for kindly accepting and writing this forward. She will be here with us, and she's here with us to discuss this book. So thank you very much. And we're going to go ahead so that we can have time for the rest of the chapters and presentations. And very briefly, we're going to tell you what the three parts of the book are about. We decided that the first part, which is called Resistance, Language, and Identity Among Mexican Origin Transnational Youth, we offer contributions spanning borders with authors who have lived on both sides of the border, in a final contribution which in many ways transcends borders with its focus on indigenous youth. And this will be discussed by David Martinez Prieto, who is here today as well. The second part of this book is formal schooling and transnationalism from an Anzalduan lens. and it highlights skills and challenges faced in two distinct educational contexts, higher education in the US and Mexican K-12 education. And here we have two chapters from Janet Martinez in TAC, in Kathleen here. And the last part, the final section, is about theorizing transnationalism with Anzalduan. And it has three unique contributions that engage mestiza consciousness, language, and the colonial identity approaches. So now I think that we turn this into David. You're going to be the first one.
Sure. Can you see my screen? Yeah, you can see my screen, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Bueno, buenas tardes, soy David. Gracias por estar aquí. I'll talk about my chapter, which I entitled Nations Within Nations, the Heterogeneity of Mexican Transnationals of Indigenous Descent from Anzalduan Lenses. And I'll do it in Spanish and English, right, in both, so, para honrar el legado de Gloria Anzaldúa. Y aparte porque vivo en el Río Grande Valley, entonces todo el mundo habla dos idiomas al mismo tiempo. So I'll go, first I want to mention something that I consider quite important. It was very difficult for me to accept Anzaldua's framework because of the epistemologies I was exposed to while I was a child and while I was an adolescent. Durante toda mi preparatoria, la gran parte de mi universidad, mi primaria en México, I was always told, or I always taught to reject anything that is related to Mexican American epistemologies. So as a Mexican national, it was so hard for me to interiorize, reflect, and finally accept that Anzaldua's ideas were meaningful in order to understand transnationalism. A final de cuentas, me di cuenta que buscamos lo mismo, ¿no? Que buscamos lo mismo, que a pesar de que nos enseñan cosas que dividen las comunidades en lugar de unirlas, nos damos cuenta, me di cuenta que el trabajo de Anzaldúa busca terminar con la opresión, que yo creo que es lo que todos buscamos como educadores, ¿no? En la intersección de imperialismo, racismo y machismo, ¿no? Pertinent to this chapter, which I'll be mentioning later, is the recognition of Anzaldúa to the fact that oppression doesn't occur in isolation, and it's not a phenomena that is just happening right now. It goes back all the way up to las comunidades indígenas, ¿no? El imperio azteca, la diferencia entre las comunidades y el mismo poder que ejercían los aztecas contra algunas comunidades indígenas, ¿no? También Anzaldúa menciona como la colonia española y luego el mestizaje mexicano, una idea rígida de mexicanidad. It has helped little in terms of understanding the trajectories of Mexican American or Mexican transnational communities, right? De alguna forma ella explica que que estas ideas se reproducen en términos de opresión. La opresión, y si se siguen, como vamos a ver en un momento, se siguen reproduciendo a través de las fronteras, ¿no? ¿De qué trata esta investigación? Esta investigación trata de analizar las identidades de tres pre-service teachers that were transnationals, meaning they live in the US, and either because they voluntarily decide to go back to Mexico, or because they were forced to go back to Mexico, they continue their education in Mexico. Data was collected en tres estados de México, en Puebla, yo soy de Puebla, en Oaxaca y en Tlaxcala, durante 2017 y 2018. And this is something important, right? I was not intending to analyze indigenous populations. When I started my piloting my dissertation research, yo pensaba que esto era un ente monolítico, ¿no? Mexican transnationals. But no, I eventually realized that there are nations within nations. Los transnacionales vivieron en Estados Unidos, pero ellos vienen de diferentes comunidades indígenas, lo cual hace que haya diferencias entre la forma de que conciben su identidad. Mis participantes, aquí los puse en un mapita. Elena from La Magdalena Tlaltemuco in Tlaxcala. She lived in New York before returning to Puebla. Donají, she lived in Tehuantepec, Oaxaca, and before she returned to Oaxaca, she lived in Illinois. And then Ceci, which is here, she lived in Izúcar de Matamoros, Puebla, and before returning to Puebla, she lived in California. All of them were pursuing a degree in English language teaching in a Mexican public university. ¿Qué encontré? Me encontré que Elena, Ceci y Donají estaban conscientes de su origen mexicano, pero ellas hacían sentido de su origen mexicano en términos de su indigenismo, de su origen indígena, ¿no? So all the three of them made sense of their Mexicanness based on their indigenous origin. However, the different trajectories of their communities, la historia de sus pueblos was heterogeneous, was pretty much very different from each other. Por ejemplo, I asked Elena how she felt about being Mexican or indigenous, and she said, well, yes, I'm Mexican, but most Mexicans don't understand the importance of Tlaxcala for the Mexican nation. They see us, meaning Tlaxcalans, as los traidores, no? They see us as the ones who helped the Spaniards. There are even people who make fun of us and say, Tlaxcala no existe. En Tlaxcala encontré a gente de México que yo decía que era de Tlaxcala. Ellos me decían que éramos los traidores. They do not really understand the importance of Tlaxcala. Without Tlaxcala, the indigenous community she was from, Mexico would not exist, right? Que es un poco similar a la historia de Donají, a la forma que ella entendía su identidad. Ella me dijo, soy mexicana, pero probablemente me identifico mejor como oaxaqueña o como zapoteca. También en los Estados Unidos, I feel that Mexicans don't support each other much, but we, meaning Zapotecans, did support each other. Y eso es muy importante, ¿no? Muchos mexicanos, they carry ideas from the US, from Mexico to the US. So, according to her, Mexicans are already discriminated in the US, but also Mexicans discriminate other Mexicans themselves, right? Because of the ideologies they bring from Mexico in terms of these rigid ideologies of what is Mexican and what is not Mexican, right? Ahora que estoy de regreso en Oaxaca, yo veo lo mismo aquí. Los indígenas solamente somos buenos cuando leemos acerca de ellos en los textbooks, right? So people, I mean, indigenous communities are only good when they're in textbooks, but not in the actual, day-to-day life. Un tema que encontré es que hay a veces there's a monolithic conceptualization of Mexican indigeneity in the academic trajectories of the participants, right? For example, Donají explained, people over there in the US don't understand, they don't know that we are different nations. Para ellos, todo es relacionado con los aztecas. Todo. Even I had a teacher in high school, she was Mexican-American, and she was into Chicano culture and all that. She would talk about Aztlán in the class, about Nahuatl language, and she was expecting that I would help her in the class, that I participated more, that I would support her. But I don't have any relationship with this, right? Aquí lo que está haciendo Donají es poniendo o distinguiendo que ella no tiene nada que ver con la cultura azteca, ¿no? Que los zapotecas tienen una historia de resistencia que de hecho es en contra del imperio azteca, ¿no? Que tuvieron que resistir mucho en contra de los imperios aztecas. Entonces eso no tenía nada que ver con ella, a pesar de ambos ser indígenas, ¿no? O tener que ver con las naciones indígenas. In a similar vein, Elena emphasized that the Mexican-American society in the United States completely ignores the relevance of Tlaxcala nations. Before coming back to Mexico, I considered doing a degree there in the US, something about Mexican-American studies. But when I researched more about their classes, then I looked more deeply at their program, I realized that everything was about the Aztecs, only Aztecs, about Aztlán, about the Mexican-Americans. But they offer nothing related to my culture, nothing related to the 400 families who arrived even there to the United States. Aquí se está refiriendo a que hubo 400 familias de Tlaxcala que se fueron con los españoles a colonizar el sur de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Nuevo México, Texas, California. And there is little information about this contribution of Tlaxcalans in the development of Mexico and also the US, right? So she was expecting to see more about her own nation. En términos concretos, el marco teórico de Anzaldúa fue muy significativo porque me ayudó a entender the systemic subjugation which influenced participant notions or their Mexican origin, right? Es decir, me ayudó a entender la intersección de poderes coloniales y patriarcales en la subyugación de personas. Lo que no me ayudó, in terms of Anzalduan's framework, it wasn't that meaningful in order for me to understand the heterogeneity of Mexicanidad and indigeneity of the participants. In other words, I felt that there was a monolithic depiction of indigenous transnationals that could cause a simplistic explanation of their individual and their nation's trajectories. Para terminar, a veces siento, como miembro de la Academia de los Estados Unidos, que de forma involuntaria hacemos cosas que contribuyen irónicamente a al perpetuamiento de poderes coloniales, ¿no? Entonces yo creo y sugiero como parte final de este capítulo que se desmitifique el impacto colonial del Imperio Azteca y lo que causó entre las poblaciones subyugadas, que también de alguna forma entendamos que hay naciones, como el caso de los tlaxcaltecas, que ayudaron a los españoles, pero they did it for their own benefit, the benefit of their own nations, right? We need to understand that they've been subjugated for several centuries. Y finalmente debemos de entender que al crear espacios para entender con las complejidades, we need to legitimize the history and current context of transnational indigenous communities, which have been silenced because of mainstream conceptions of indigenities. Al final del día, pienso que tenemos que entender que las comunidades indígenas son agentes sociales del cambio y debemos entender que a través de ellos podemos encontrar o entender the realities in a better way. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And now we go with Tak.
Being on, microphone on.
We hear you
Yes.
now, Zach. Thank you.
Great. Okay. In this application of Anzaldua's borderland theory, I examined the stories of 3 young women who embody the adaptability and sensitivity required of those who, in Anzaldua's words, inhabit los intersticios, the spaces between the different worlds in which they reside. And so I introduce you to Jimena, Chiara, and Wendy, 3 amazing women, each of whom I have known for several years and who have generously shared their lives and their stories with me. And they are here this evening. So special thank you to them for joining us, and thank you to everyone who has supported this project. They are 3 of an estimated 1 to 3 million Mexican origin persons who, since the beginning of the 21st century, moved from the United States to Mexico, or moved back in some cases. As we hear their stories, we'll examine them through the lens of Anzaldua, of course, whose life, work, and theory invite us to think beyond borders, move beyond boundaries of categories, and see and beyond binaries. I hope as we go, you'll see how these women have moved about in the spaces they inhabited, exhibited agency, overcome obstacles, embraced their identities in adulthood. At the end, we will find ourselves in the liminal place that Anzaldua and the Nahuatl people long before her calls Nepantla. This work is part of a long sociolinguistic research project that I started in 2010 in Puebla, Mexico, and continued in Zacatecas from 2018 up to and beyond the pandemic beginnings in March 2020. Over the years, I have observed, interviewed transnational families, mostly children and youth, but also administrators, educators, and others with experience with transnational students. All students cross a border of sorts when they leave home and start school. Students who speak a language or variety at home that is different from that of education, the language of education, cross a linguistic border as well. The transnational students that I have met over the years began their young lives with Spanish as the primary or only language of home, and then starting school meant starting to learn English. The young women in this study are no exception. Jimena was born in Los Angeles in 1987. Her parents had moved there 5 years earlier. Jimena's education began at age 3 at a local Head Start. She transitioned to elementary school in the unified Los Angeles Public School District. District. Throughout her young life, she and her family traveled to Mexico to visit relatives for short trips, but Mexico was her parents' homeland, not hers. However, just 1 month before her 12th birthday, Jimena and her family made the one-way journey to her parents' homeland in the state of Zacatecas. Kiara was born in Pasadena, California in 2000. When she started school, Kiara's teacher encouraged her and her mother, her father and her mother, to continue to speak Spanish to Kiara at home and not to worry that she would learn English in school. Kiara recalled how her parents read to her in Spanish from a young age and encouraged her to read in Spanish at home. One day when she was 11, Kiara and her mother made the one-way trip to Kiara's parents' homeland to say goodbye to Kiara's grandmother who was dying. Wendy was born in Zacatecas. When she was 5 years old, her parents moved the family to the United States. She told me about her first day of kindergarten, how she stood frozen on that border between what she knew, her home life in Spanish, and a classroom full of English speakers. She didn't want to walk through the classroom door for fear that she would be unable to communicate with her classmates, but she mustered her courage and went in. Over the next few years, Wendy would return to Mexico and then back to the US, Denver specifically, where they stayed for 6 more years. Wendy recounted that she and a friend got in trouble for speaking Spanish at school. They had to whisper and pass notes secretly. Wendy was about to finish her first year of high school when the family moved back to Mexico. International migrants, like the women in this study, cross international borders and then academic ones for at least a second time as they make their way into Mexican schools. Almost immediately, transnational students are confronted with the reality that the Spanish they have been using at home and in the community in the United States is not the same as academic Spanish. The lexicon and even the syntax of daily life and familial interaction varies considerably from that of academic language. And I distinguish this formal variety from the oral language of the home, which for all of its intricacies and complexities doesn't prepare students for the text-based experience they will encounter in Mexican school. Each of the women in this study experienced some difficulty with written and or spoken Spanish. At first glance, the transition from reading English to Spanish may not seem so difficult. However, as many monolingual English speakers who have taken Spanish in school can attest, the similarities in cognates are an insufficient route to proficiency. Students who begin their schooling in Mexico in late elementary or early secondary, as the women in this study, have been developing style, skills, and vocabulary in English appropriate to their grade level. But it's not very common for students to develop Spanish to the same degree because dual language bilingual education programs in the United States are few and far between. Besides this, they have gaps in content. Jimena recalled that the other kids in her class in Mexico had been studying things all her life about which she knew nothing. She said, I had no idea of Mexican history, Mexican geography, Spanish, just about everything. Anzalduan says, ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. English is part of the identity of transnational students. English used to be a part of their everyday lives with friends and in their communities. Once in Mexico, transnational students might use English with some family members or on social media or online gaming or texting, but at school, English is relegated to a few hours a week. English classrooms can be opportunities to shine or places of burden and embarrassment for transnational students. Jimena said that at first, English class was fun. She said, it was easy. It was something you already know. But when I got to high school, my teacher told me, don't come to English class if you don't want to. Instead, the teacher gave her more advanced work, such as novels, to read outside of class. When she was in 6th grade, just 12 years old, Kiara was regularly told by her teacher to take care of the class. Kiara recalled another teacher telling her she didn't have to do the work. You already know English. But Kiara fought for her right to be taught and challenged her teacher, saying, I want to do it, even just to prove myself or learn a little bit more. For Wendy, English class offered a sense of belonging, where she felt more American and more connected. But when the other students pleaded with her to teach them, Wendy, a middle schooler at the time, declined. Yo sé inglés, pero yo no sé enseñarlo. She acknowledged the strength she possessed due to her transnational experience, but she let them know that even though she knew English, she was not a trained teacher. Jimena, Kiara, and Wendy have developed strategies to become adept at what Anzaldúa calls switching modes and overcoming obstacles, at times standing up to authoritative structures, and at other times by seeking help within them. Both are means of exercising agency. None of the women in this study report any kind of systematic accommodations. However, each one was able to complete not only obligatory required basic education through 9th grade in Mexico, but high school and university. Lifelong sojourners, they have learned to construct bridges from where they were to where they wanted to be. Jimena, Kiara, and Wendy have charted their courses by associating with identities that resist the binaries of aquí or allá and the notion that they need to identify with only one place. Words like biculture and binational imply knowledge and experience of two cultures, but that may be misleading, leaving impressions of two identities, two entities, when the reality is something more of a merged or fused or mestizaje, to use Anzaldúa's terminology. Transnationals incorporate into their self-perception not only the place where they're born and the place where they are now, but also a, quote, global culture, thus leading to a complex hybrid identity. And that's from Arnett 2002. When we talked about identity, Jimena simply stated, I'm both. Kiara, growing up in Pasadena, the daughter of 2 Mexican parents, loved to tell people she was Mexican. I don't usually say it, but I'm really proud. I'm really proud of both sides. She told me about a book she read when she was 18, where she learned the concept of Chicana. She has completely embraced the term, even though she doesn't know anybody else who personally uses it. Wendy stated emphatically and proudly that she did not have a clearly defined identity in terms of where she is from. No tengo una identidad definida en cuanto a donde soy. She did not lament her unbounded identity. She embraced it, recognizing that her experience is what has motivated her to engage with others and their cultures. Through language, she has found her way back to feeling at home, back to the water. At the time of our last interview, she was enrolled in a training program for practicing English language educators. Y cuando estoy en mis clases de inglés ahora, siento que otra vez estoy como un pez en el agua. Once again, I'm a fish in the water. I am my language, declares Anzaldúa, and in so doing lays claim to an identity of hybridity, where a variety of languages and language varieties are spoken. She challenges notions of a single standard and scoffs at prescriptivist Spanish speakers who attempt to throw their bag of rules at her. She speaks of home tongues rather than a mother tongue or a native tongue. In college, others wanted to control her tongue. She was forced to take accent reduction classes. Anzaldúa embraced her multifaceted self-expression. She bristled at the insults and consequences her speech and language provoked in others. Like Wendy, she was punished by her teachers for speaking Spanish at school and making requests of teachers. Anzaldúa's own mother was mortified that she spoke English like a Mexican, downgrading her daughter's education to nothing if she spoke accented English. As with the rest of Anzaldúa's borderland theory, language is not reduced to the duality of either or, but where a distinct identity is formed when emulsifying one with the other. More than a new linguistic amalgam, in borderlands theory, the third element is a new mestiza consciousness, a hybrid space of resistance and activism. The women presented in this chapter, for whom every day is a crossing of linguistic and cultural boundaries, have been, in Anzaldúa's words, forced to live in the interface between the two realities. With no ready mediators or guides to escort them from one world to the other, no mentors, no orientation or support group, they have become young nepantleras, boundary crossers, thresholders. Wendy is an English teacher. Jimena prepares others to teach. Chiara is writing her undergraduate thesis on the psychological consequences of return migration. She imagines a future supporting transnational students' mental and emotional well-being. As adults, these women initiate others in rites of passage. They're activistas who rise to their own visions and shift into acting them out, haciendo un mundo nuevo, introducing change. Perhaps among those others, the ones who would listen to their voices, are those of us whose research and advocacy work has brought us into their stories and into their lives. These young women have chosen to disassociate with a narrative of colonialism and exclusion by gaining an awareness of and claiming their identities. As if taking a cue from Anzaldúa herself, they have responded to the call to create a new narrative. Will we join them?
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much, Jack. And now we go to Steve.
Okay, muy bien. Buenas tardes a todos. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. Let me put it on from start. Bueno, es un verdadero placer y gusto para mí formar parte de este grupo and to be in this text that I have here that I might read from in a little bit. I want to acknowledge that, first of all, I just want to thank all of you. Dr. Valenzuela, thank you for being here and being a part of this. And Suan Irasema, thank you. David, I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. You too, Tak. Thank you so much. I took notes and I see a lot of overlap in different things. When David says that the youth carried ideas with them, it's very similar to what I'll be talking about. And Tak, I was going to use the quote from Anzaldúa, if you really want to hurt me, speak bad of my language. I am my language. And I had taken it out last night to get down on time a little bit. So I was glad to see that. The chapter that I wrote with Omar Serna is called It's All Gone South. It's a discourse analysis of the language used to talk about transnational youth. When I started reading Gloria Anzaldúa, I loved the imagery, I loved the metaphors, and it drew me in. And what I like to sit back and think about is who controls those metaphors today? Who tells the story of transnational youth? In what ways are those metaphors at times co-opted by other people? And so I really want to, from an applied linguistics point of view, take a look at a couple conceptual phenomena, metonymy, metaphor, and myth, to see how we can create a new language, a new consciousness, a new mythos with transnational youth. So Anzaldúa used metaphors to teach us how to live and how to understand how life imposes upon some and keeps specific populations down. But before we can talk about metaphor, we need to talk about what builds it, and that's metonymy, conceptual metonymy. And then after there's metaphor, I ask us to realize that people use that and attach myths to it that don't always get questioned. So a little bit about metonymy. A couple years ago, I asked my oldest child to draw a picture of people waiting in a line, and this is what they drew. And I asked my child, Micah, does that line continue? And they said, yes, it does. And I said, well, how do you know that? You don't see the end of it. And they said, I just know. That's conceptual metonymy. Metonymy is a cognitive phenomena where one part can stand for the whole thing. We only need to see one part to understand that the rest exists. So I'll start with metonymy and go into metaphor and end with two myths that represent the chapter that Omar and I wrote. Anzaldua talked about how culture forms our beliefs and thus our version of reality. And I just ask us to think about the conceptual language, the metonymy, the metaphor, the mythologies, which are controlled, naturalized worldviews that form our culture and thus our beliefs. And it's here where people discover the place in the world, their place in the world, and perhaps how to resist and defy it. So metonymy is not always linguistic. We have metonymy in art, in clothing, in classroom, organization, and many people that may not even care about sports would recognize that the girl centered and on top is the best, that the man with the biggest arm and influenced by our reading from left to right, the man that comes first is going to win. Directions are interesting. If we think about the title of this chapter, north is clearly not up and south is not down. That's north and that's south and that's west and that's east. I'm not really sure. I'm kind of norteado here on campus. But in our language, we associate up with north and down with south. When I was a high school classroom teacher, I had this map up in my classroom and all of the words are readable, but my students would say, your map is upside down. I'd say, no, it's really not. There's north isn't up and south isn't down. You know, the world is a sphere and you could look at it from any different way. And it was incredible the influence that this map had on my students, where they started asking more questions about Lesotho or questions about Paraguay and Uruguay. And it reoriented them a little bit. But this definitely influences the way we think. The way we talk influences the way we think. And I would ask us to think about the phrase, gone south. And we use this in English to talk about things that went bad, got worse, deteriorated, such as the stock market headed south again. In our chapter, we have 4 transnational youth who wrote, they're adults now, they wrote testimonials. And in one testimonial, we counted over 6 times that the participant wrote, I went back down, or I returned down to Mexico. I went back down to Guanajuato, and framed it that way, that north was up and south was down. Just a quick search on the internet would give us, for gone south, would give us something like the city had the flood under control, then a trickle turned into a stream, then into a full-size breach, and then things went south quickly, as if to say it went bad. And I like this example because it attaches to one of the myths that I'm going to talk about, and that's that transnational youth and immigrants are like water. And we use that so often, a stream, a new wave, trickling, streaming over the border. And Otto Santa Ana has documented water metaphors for quite a while now, and this has really embedded into our speech. So this way of talking produces implicit deficit-based conceptual metonymies regarding what comes from down south, down Mexico way, as you can see in the photo here of a library here in Fort Worth, or from below the border, which works its way into many political speeches with people with agendas to produce fear. This north-south is not simply a geographical distinction, but it relates to dominance, privilege, and elite discourses, and the inequality of these manifest within local, regional, and international spaces. These definitely make their way into schooling. And a quick conversation with teachers about their expectations of students from down south versus students who have immigrated from the north or from Europe or however, and we see these racio-linguistic ideologies bubble up pretty quickly. What I find interesting, and I used this phrase a minute or two ago, is I need to do another paper, because in Mexico to say that someone is norteado is disoriented or lost or anda perdido or however. So I need to look into that directional metaphor, as Lakoff would say. So I want to talk about one of the metonymies, metaphors, and myths that we cover in our chapter. And that's this idea that Santa Ana and Teresa Catalano have talked a lot about, of a flood of legal and illegal immigrants streaming into the country. There's so much conceptual language here. The metonymies are actions for water, actions of water for people, legal status for person or attribute for entity, a perilous flow that implies harm and displacement. The metaphors are immigrants are dangerous water, or the country is a basin or a house or a home that can be overflowed or hurt somehow, damaged. And the myth is that transnational youth pose a threat or some kind of danger to the country that will reach its tipping point. These myths make their way into speaking, they're naturalized and they're justified. And that's what these youth have to contend with here in the US and when they return to Mexico. So this brings us to myth and where do mythologies come from? A little semiotics here. Myth is experienced as innocent speech. We very rarely question it. Anything can be a myth. I think Sue and Iracema will talk about La Malinche next, but I just want to show that art is used as a myth. This is a painting from Jose Orozco or Jose Clemente Orozco in la Ciudad de Mexico, and we see that La Malinche is facing left and down, and Kress and Van Leuven have shown us about positioning and framing, that this would make her look as a dominated, weak, looking towards the past, subjugated figure, just strengthening the myth. So if we apply this to the water metaphor, all we need is some concept of rushing dangerous water. That concept then turns into form, which then creates a sign, and we call this the first order semiological chain. So this is how we show it in the book. This is the most literal first order semiological chain of signifier, flood, signified great amounts of rushing water, sign, a danger of some kind. So then to create a myth, we just add a second level, and this is done all the time and people don't question it. And that's the danger in some of the metaphors that Anzaldúa uses that I think people are destroying in some ways. Like the bridge, we have to ask about the corriente que va abajo del bridge that's hurting the bridge. And we have to attack some of this mythology, this language. So the new signifier that's added is linking large numbers of people to water to create a second semiological chain. So the first one is very literal. It's just the water. But the second one, adding a signifier to the existing sign, connects it to a flood of people, to a signified swelling number of people and immigrants, to a new myth of a relentless, overwhelming surge of immigrants as dangerous, destructive water. So I'll end with how do we vanish or how do we vanquish a myth? We can't fight a myth by denying it. This only makes it stronger. Think about any political argument you've had lately with someone. If you tell them they're being crazy, it just strengthens their crazy. So we have to start with their myth, work off of their crazy, and add a third semiological chain. Use the myth for our own altruistic good. So taking and saying, yes, there are large amounts of immigrant youth, transnational youth that are flowing like water, but this replenishes, invigorates, and refreshes the knowledge, experience, and strength of the US country or the body. And I'll let Sue and Iracema talk about this, but we do mythify the myth of Malinche in our chapter as well. So what's it look like to add a third semiological chain? We take the existing myth and we add a new signifier to it. A flood, a wave of immigrants becomes a new understood form or signified rushing water. invigorating and refreshing, and the new myth of these youth refreshing, making stronger our country and the country of origin. So in conclusion, conceptual metaphor metonymy theory helps humans understand the world, especially people who are feeling vulnerable and weakened and looking for a solution. These are stories that help us understand and make sense of the world. Anzaldua paints and writes beautiful stories, and I would just ask us to analyze who's telling that story today and if it's always positive for transnational youth. In order to create a new language, a new mythos, a new consciousness, we must pay attention to conceptual language and make it our own. And then we provide a transnational funds of knowledge water cycle to support that new water myth in our chapter as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much, Steve. And as Sam is pulling up the slide, the first slide of our presentation, I just wanted to let the audience know that we co-wrote this as a sort of ethical imperative in our own research. We've been doing well over a decade each, looking at transnational youth. I used to look mostly at transnational youth north of the US-Mexico border. On a Fulbright for a year in Mexico in about 2017, Sam and I had many conversations about why are so many of these brilliant young people who are multilingual, bilingual in Mexico suffering in their hometowns when they try to speak English with their loved ones. And so we decided to theorize it, and that's what you're about to hear about. There's real pain and suffering that sort of barely get borne out in some of the data, and that this is the whole project of this book, is to really complicate and enflesh real bodies, waves, to use Steve's language, right, of humans who have so much invigoration that they can bring, if yet we were only open to it. And David and Patricia Sanchez and I have written about the hidden knowing of transnational youth, mostly north of the border, but we see it here and we'll present lovingly. Anita Sam, I'll let you go ahead and get into this.
Well, thank you very much. And we decided to start this presentation, and we selected this cartoon that we thought that it was very provoking, but in reality, it also shows us some reality that we're going to find in the data that we're going to present. So it says here, if you can read this, you're not a true Mexican. And that is like the basis for what we are doing in this chapter, because some Mexicans who dare to speak English in Mexico, then they are immediately classified as Malinchistas, or that they prefer everything that comes from the north. So then this is what we present in this chapter, which is called Malinches Move from Trader to Survivor, recasting Mexico's first indigenous woman to reframe Mexican origin transnationals returning home. Sue?
So as I mentioned, Sam and I conversationally recognized a lot of pain of the research participants that we worked with, most of them future English teachers who were hyper multicultural and hyper multilingual. And time and again, the young people we were working with were called traidores, cabachos. They were asked questions like, ¿Quién te crees? Whenever they would speak just a little bit of English, maybe with a loved one, and their new or their original home language had turned into English oftentimes. And so we realized that we needed to work through and theorize this malinchismo. And as Sam has said, malinchismo is this notion of Mexicans who are self-loathing, self-hating, and always embracing the imported, what comes from Europe or the United States or the West, if you will. So this anti-malinchismo, we're using kind of post-colonial theory and Anzalduan theory to say, we're recognizing this is a way to sort of preserve your dignity, but it's maybe needs a little bit more theorizing. And I'll quote Anzaldua here. She says, necesitamos hacer teorías that will rewrite history using race, class, gender, and ethnicity as categories of analysis, theories that cross borders, that blur boundaries, new kinds of theories with new theorizing methods, which is what we're attempting to do here. So this anti-Malinchismo or Malinchismo comes from the historic figure of Malinche, and we realize some people in the audience might not be entirely familiar. She's considered to be the first mother of mestizo people of Mexico. She was the mother of Hernán Cortés, the first conqueror from Spain and Mexico, of children with him, not entirely willingly as far as what the historic record renders. Also, she was sold as tribute at an early age, also hyper multilingual of multiple indigenous languages. And what we see from her is an ability to survive and even thrive in some circumstances. You know, how many of us, being a mother myself, you know, what wouldn't we do to save our people, to save our flesh, even if we haven't born them yet? And so we see Malinche, you know, she was heavily involved in negotiations with the conquistadores, with indigenous groups throughout Mexico, bearing these children. You know, what we say is, how can we hate Malinche so much if in fact it's because of Malinche that so many were able to flourish and survive? So we can skip this. There's a great theorist, Sipus, who theorizes this really well. We lean into Anzaldua's conceptions of Nepantla, of being in that complicated in between, harnessing one's cultural toolkits, creating the new. And we're about to show several examples in the empirical work that kind of pull into focus these findings. Go ahead, Iracema.
Yes, well, stories that we present here come from 31 university students, and as Sue mentioned before, at the time they were studying an English program, an English teaching program at two public universities in Mexico, one university in Hidalgo and the other one in Guanajuato. For the reasons of the chapter, then we decided, we made a selection, and then we're just presenting some stories. But some of them had different reasons for returning to Mexico. Some of them because of deportation, some of them because of the impossibility of continuing with their university studies in the United States, and others for family reasons. So then all of them had complete different reasons. And we're going to see here how these painful stories at times, we might think that they come from older people who might not know them. But we're going to see how sometimes these hate discourses, they come from the same family or within the same family once they are here back in Mexico. Some of the topics that they addressed or that we're going to present are related to these, which are humiliation within the family, bullying of students and teachers, being a teacher of my classmates, hybrid identity, and being between two worlds. So we're going to start with our first story, and this comes from Patty in the state of Hidalgo, and she describes her experience during the completion of a Spanish language test at the age of 10 after her recent arrival in the state of Hidalgo. We wanted to keep this in Spanish because that was the original language in which they actually reported this, but we're going to do it, as we mentioned before, this is a bilingual presentation. So then Patty says, a teacher was very mean to me. Like, how is it possible that you don't know this in Spanish? And she said, well, I don't know Spanish. And I had to take an exam. And I was like, I don't understand anything, nothing. And I would look at the clock and think, do I have to put what time it is? So I just put it on and stood up, and she told me, do whatever you understand. And I said, I just know that. She couldn't believe it. And she said, no, that can be possible. You need to know more. But I didn't know. And she was, the teacher was very frustrated, and then Patty started to cry. But here we can see how a teacher humiliated Patty in front of the whole class for not knowing Spanish. I mean, in the teacher's mind, it's like, you're Mexican, you should know Spanish. But in this case, Patty was not responsible for that. Her humiliation at school was so severe that her parents actually transferred her to a private school. But in the case of Patty, she was one of those who was like lucky to be able to change from the environment. But this is something that it is not very common for many other participants. Here we have another one, and then we can see like how painful this can be, like the discourse that we use with transnationals or returnees. This is the case of Yolanda. Yolanda also at the age of 10 arrived in the state of Hidalgo and experienced a similar situation. She said the most difficult thing was that she didn't know any Spanish. Yolanda explained, I was the perfect target for bullying. She commented that she received the nickname Manteca, which would be like chubby, since she returned to Mexico, weighing 80 kilos more or less at the age of 10. But the worst part for her was the pain caused by her aunt. It was a bit tough for me to face the reality that my aunt was going to fail me because the aunt was the teacher, and she sent me back to kindergarten for not knowing Spanish. After 2 months of suffering an intense period of bullying and having lost 30 kilos of weight, her mother made the decision to remove her from school. So here we can see parallels with Malinche. Malinche as a woman was unable to protect herself and was personified more as a property rather than as agent. And our next story is about Laura. And Laura is in Guanajuato. When she returned to Guanajuato, her teacher realized that she spoke English. So the teacher decided to take advantage and gave her the class, gave her the responsibility to be in charge of the class. And she said, well, I would not treat my students like they treated me. For example, I would not ask them to teach my English class and send them a message that I could identify them as returnees or as native speakers. I would put them aside and say to them, if you feel like saying something, say it. Or if you want to participate more and help me, go ahead, do it. And just do it if you want to do it, if you can. And if not, that's fine. Because her experience was painful, and so she received like a lot of responsibility at a very young age because she wasn't the teacher, she was only another student in the class. And for her, as she says here, this is completely unprofessional on the part of the teacher, and it happened to me, and it is not pleasant for the students at all. And we have this other one from state of Hidalgo. In this case, it is Eloy. And Eloy shares a concrete example that demonstrates that the complex nature of the experiences resulting from this hybridity. And he mentions sometimes you can think of some things in English and you can't think of them in Spanish, or vice versa. Or maybe there are things that you did in the United States, for example, that you live a year alone, and that's kind of unusual for young Mexicans. So in this case, it is not only about the language, but it is also about the way that he conducted himself and his life, because he was behaving as American in Mexico. And then for Mexicans, it was like, no, I mean, this is muy gringo. So Eloy explains that he has had this experience of living alone for a year in another country, and that this was, that this allowed him to mature, something unusual for Mexicans. And we don't want to say that one experience is better than the other, but they are definitely different, and this allows like different ways of understanding life in the case of our participants. Sue?
So thank you, Iracema. I'll just kind of pull it together the best I can. These returnees, in so many ways, kind of embody a similar experience to Malinche, as you just explained, Iracema. From a gender perspective, we can see that the returnee is also attributed to a lower role, as Malinche is in history as well. I'm going to just kind of sum up with a quote from De Alba and extend it a little bit. De Alba says, Malinche's rebellious shadow beast, and she's citing Anzaldua when referring to the shadow beast, dares us to look into the mirror and experience what Anzaldua called the knowing, the inner power that results from our underworld journeys into consciousness. Suddenly, the repressed energy rises, makes decisions, connects with conscious energy, and a new life begins. And so that's what we see in the participants that Iracema and I had the pleasure to work with. this ability to survive, thrive, this sobrevivencia kind of knowing, where uno puede seguir adelante a pesar de todo, right? And they do it in these hybrid practices that often remain hidden, like Eloy just said in that last slide. And, you know, our call is to recognize that we need to allow the space, just like we've written about transnationals in the US, allow the space for people to be who they are in their hybrid fashions, so that we might learn from and with them as well. And so I'll conclude there, and just before Angela comes back in, just say that our larger vision, all of us as authors in these various chapters, is un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, un mundo sordo, as Anzaldúa calls it, this left-handed world where there's space for liminals, where there's space, it's really the only space of growth, these nepantla phases, right? The opportunity for people to be nepantleras, who are all sort of angling and their own self-work, as Anzaldúa says, I changed myself, I changed the world, toward a social transformation of este mundo, this world where many worlds are able to fit. So Angela, I'll invite you to come in and comment, please. We cannot hear you, Angela.
Your microphone?
Thank you. Yeah, no, just a beautiful work. I feel so enriched by having been able to read this volume and to write the foreword to it and to reflect on it. It's very meaty. There's a lot in it that, you know, really encourage everyone to get it and to chew on it. There's a lot to chew on. I'm particularly like impacted by, you know, this, just, you know, the idea of what social transformation entails, drawing on, you know, picking up what you just said, what it entails. And it does involve acknowledging our many and multiple and complex and conflicting identities, right? And ni de aquí, ni de allá. It's interesting how we just casually say that, and yet that establishes a binary, right? And well, que es allá, que es aquí, right? And I don't think that we really, even in our own language, even with the concept of being bilingual and bicultural, it really strikes me as a little bit conservative, because it doesn't take into account this complexity, and it's, I guess I take away an impression I have is how we're denied that, right? And so a lot of what we think and feel it comes out of that. It comes out of being denied the complexities of our languages, our identities, our ideas, our worldviews, our perspectives, our lived experiences, which is the norm, right? And it's the norm both in Mexico and in the United States. And so the idea that transnationalism can help us move the needle in both countries, and not just in terms of how we understand children, but how we ourselves, you know, sort of deconstruct ideas as they travel, not only across borders, but how they are marshaled in ways that can be, you know, not really helpful, very, very narrow to, and even harmful to use ideas on the metonyms, right? And these horrible kinds of metaphors that just seem to guide, I mean, not only how we think about transnationals and immigrant youth so much of the time, but how they get cast and framed in ways that you know, just unconsciously become they become threats. And of course, we're in this moment of you know, of like just great hardship for our community and fear. I think that this text draws us to more is to the internal dialogue, like the much needed conversation that we haven't had. And it's, you know, in what ways are we actually reinscribing coloniality, right? Through our language, through our frameworks, our metaphors. And so I would like to invite people, because we do have 20 more minutes to this conversation, to in the Q&A to have any questions you might have, to go ahead and ask that. I do have questions. If you don't have any, I think that's the space on the Q&A tab, right? To put forward any questions.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think just a word about Anzaldua is, yeah, I mean, definitely she has energized so much scholarship, so much intellectual thinking, concepts that I think will be evergreen, that will forever, I think, be impactful. And yes, it's the epistemological and it's the ontological social justice commitments, like David shared, to eliminate ultimately patriarchy and oppression, and really this extractive relationship to Mother Earth. But she was also herself complex in her identity. Yes, she was from the U.S.-Mexican border. She was a lesbian and had to live as a lesbian in South Texas and in Texas, and in her life, embracing complexity and hardship that helped her to be, I think, the person that she became in so many ways. She was someone who helped us to, think about colonialism and how borders themselves are not just physical, but they're symbolic and metaphorical. And of course, that's what comes out in the text. There is a comment here. I went to Bowie High School in El Paso, Texas, 5 minutes from the border, where our community was heavy in 2 languages. Have you heard of this community? If so, have you had an interest in learning and building scholarship in this complex society? Anyone on the panel focused on El Paso, El Colegio FUR? I'm not sure which that is.
I mean, all the border towns are fascinating. It's so complex. If anybody from UT Rio Grande Valley, actually, I know Olmo, Dr. Fregoso, that you're there. I was close to having an interview with them, and then I took a job somewhere else before I could go. And David, of course, you're there too. The border is just, it's amazing and fraught and tense. And I would love to invite any of us. We'll come and we'll work with you.
Anytime. If I can just comment on that. Bueno, no vivimos en El Paso, we live in Brownsville. Our campus is just across the border. So from our campus, we see the border patrol coming back and forth. For me, it was very shocking the very first 2 weeks. All this institutional methods of surveillance, right? Of watching over people. Yo dando clase y viendo la patrulla fronteriza. But we do live, I mean, my students do live in 2 countries. They come back and forth. Many of them send me emails, David, I'm not gonna make it today because I'm still making line on the borderline and I'm not gonna make it. I mean, it's too crowded. Y es complejo porque no simplemente hablamos de México y Estados Unidos. I mean, many of my students, they come from Honduras, from El Salvador. They have, I mean, they're from the Rio Grande Valley, but in terms of transnationalism, their families are not only connected to the valley and to the borderlands, they go beyond. So it becomes more and more complex when we think about our communities, and it's growing. I mean, now it's not only people from Tamaulipas and Texas. Tenemos también gente que está llegando de El Salvador, de Honduras, Haití. Entonces, all of that adds new layers into our transnational understanding and how identities become very, very flexible and very fluid.
So David, I think your point is really well taken in your piece that, we have been Mexica-centric, right? I mean, and that, a lot of that comes from, I think, just real lack of knowledge about our own histories and our cultures, again, to the point of being denied these things. And you were, it's just interesting that you've, one thought I had, that you found a home in this volume, and I can only imagine the conversations back and forth between you and Iracema and Sue about what it meant for you to make a contribution, because that's a major intellectual border that you are addressing. I think anyone could comment, but I think that this is a real innovation because we
Yes,
don't often have this
thank you.
talking back to Mexica. And if you go to Mexico, it's all Mexico City, it's all kind of, Mexica centric, and it's romanticized in so many ways. I think not necessarily intentionally. And before you answer, I would just like to say that, we have an Mexica epistemology at Academia Cuautli, and we have a Calpulli, so we have the practice, we have Danza Mexica. And so it doesn't mean that we're Aztec, it just means that, we are very much, we embrace las enseñanzas de la danza, because there's so much to rescue from there. But at the same time that we understand that there are multiple kinds of indigeneities, and it becomes like a portal to that. So with that, anyone can comment, but perhaps David first, if you would.
Thank you, Angela. I'm so honored about your comment. Thank you so much. Pues yo también, I was also romanticizing because of my education in Mexico and in the US. I was also taught to romanticize this Aztec perspective, right? It was not until I taught in Tlaxcala, and when we also worked in Oaxaca for a while, but mainly in Tlaxcala, when I noticed that Aztecs were everything I learned, I have to de-learn. Todas las ideologías que yo pensaba sobre la nación azteca, los mexicas, el gran imperio, it didn't apply to them. Actually, they were, and I for a while, I kept these ideologies in which I also unconsciously discriminated against my own students, because I always placed Aztecs as a superior power against other indigenous communities. Fue a través de que platiqué con ellos, de que estuve con ellos, de que me explicaron su historia, because they're also very close. I mean, they don't share, because they have been subjugated and they have been discriminated for many, by many people, I'm sorry, that they don't really share knowledge, right? It is very hard to get access into the Tlaxcalan, communities. Cuando trabajé con ellos fue que me di cuenta que realmente todo lo que había aprendido, pues había más acerca de lo que había aprendido. And I do think I didn't know until then that many of these people from Tlaxcala were part of, they traveled to the US, and they helped colonizing so many places, and yet they are not recognized because somos traidores, right? So I do think in a way we need to acknowledge their trajectories, and also in a way we have en nuestro afán por ser revolucionarios, hemos olvidado que también ellos eran revolucionarios in their own way, right? So they try to protect their own peoples, they try to protect their own nations against the Aztec imperialism. That's why they help Spaniards, and from them they became the traitors for the Mexican nation. So I think they do deserve some acknowledgement. But yeah, si con su, no sé qué eso que quiera comentar sobre nuestras interacciones.
I think about that, and I do think that we owe much to the Tlaxcalans, and but we don't have this conversation, and that many of us wouldn't even be alive. We wouldn't even be here, because it was the full-blooded indigenous peoples that died in huge numbers, and the Tlaxcalans, and there was this whole history of sister cities, right? The Tlaxcalans and the Españoles would travel together, and so there's those kinds of recovery efforts in history, I think, that need to be done and honored, and we do owe a lot to the Tlaxcalan people, and I think now is the time to think deeply about these this complexity in ways that that really I think illuminate the I think in a critical but constructive way the Mexica centricity that Chicanas and Chicanos have, but it is super interesting that Mexicans in Mexico don't take this up, and so that becomes a border, right? because then Anzaldua is not appealing for so many. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about this.
I would briefly add that Iracema had a major contribution by engaging so many inside Mexico del Interior scholars and contributing. And that was part of our project. We wanted Anzaldua to be speaking to investigadores de Mexico. And, you know, coincidentally, she's starting to get appealing, you know, outside of our push. So for us, this is also, you know, we're subverting, right? And we're doing the subaltern work of having Anzaldua talk to them, right? So that's all, I'll leave it at that. But Iracema was key in that work.
Iracema, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, when we started with this idea of the book, and we thought like, who would be like a part of this in both sides, I mean, in States and here in Mexico. And then immediately I contacted people that I know that they are working on this topic. And then I wasn't sure if they were interested in adding these ideas about Anzaldua or their concepts. But luckily we had a very positive response, and we have, gladly I could say that we have 6 Mexicans here in this in this book. So it was a very great opportunity for us from this side to speak and to talk about more about these concepts.
And David was in esa universidad en Tlaxcala en aquel entonces. That's how transnational we are, right? Like Olmo, you're here in the audience, so many others. I mean, the flexibility and the porousness is real. And it, you know, we're just bringing it to like published fruition.
Yeah, that's beautiful, beautiful. Well, Esme has a good, you know, a question here, Esmeralda. Dual language education in the US sets a formal, even Castilian Spanish as the standard in programming. However, many of our students and teachers don't associate or even appreciate this language variety. What hope do we have for dual language education to include and elevate the forms of Spanish, translanguaging and Spanglish that are more prominent in urban areas in Texas, California, and other borderlands? And so maybe that's a TAC question. I'm not sure, but TAC.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question and a very important one. You ask what hope do we have? In my view, the hope that we have is that the people for whom translanguaging Spanish, Spanglish, and non-textbook varieties of Spanish are native would be the ones to become the educators. I think that's one of the biggest and best hopes. There are other ways. There's consciousness raising, there's awareness, there's just taking up the discussion like we're doing now. But I think the push from the people who would like to see the change, who are the future teachers, would be, in my view, one of the best hopes. Maybe Steve has a view on that, or someone else.
Steve, why don't you jump in?
Well, it's a great question. That's something I think about a lot. And I'll just say, just to link it to the work we did in the book, that's a myth. That's a form of a standard language myth. And it's one that, you know, just gets to live, and it gets to feed off of, you know, the work that's always been done. And we need, I think there's 2 ways to go about it. We could continue to push and say, that's not it. That's not it. It needs to be this. And then at some point, we need to ask ourselves, how's that working for us? You know, has that caused a change? And so, and if it hasn't, then we need to maybe start with that standard language myth and remythify that, build off of that, and people will then, policymakers will then start recognizing translanguaging as a language as a resource orientation, a language as a right orientation. Think of the work of Richard Ruiz. And then we might have a new myth where that becomes the new standard, the translanguaging, a more of a holistic language perspective. That's just the Pollyanna in me talking, but I think that's the way we have to do it.
I think maybe it goes also back to consciousness, right? And so well, you're never going to eliminate that that power. Even the English language is a myth, right? The network English that everybody's supposed to subscribe to, and that's so harmful and destructive and on so many levels. And you know, but I always come back to Chela Sandoval, that you know, that we have to be able to have that differential Chicana feminist consciousness that says, okay, well, I'll put that here in this category, but you know, with this other, you know, in this other context, with this other community, this is what is going to have value. I think we have time for one more question. And so Isaac Hernandez, first and foremost, congratulations to everyone, and thanks to everyone who made this text possible. I believe this text contributes to more of an asset-based perspective on teaching and learning on both sides of the border. How do you think this text contributes to transnational migration and education beyond the US-Mexico border, as in the case of other countries? So anyone can answer. It's a pretty big question, so I think it's a good one to end on.
Well, I think, thank you, Isaac, for your question. And I think that a key concept here is la frontera, I mean, from Anzaldúa, but not to see the frontera as a geographical border, but more as a cultural border in constant transition, where many can live, where many languages can interact, when many identities are playing at the same time, and especially those who cross the limits of what it is called normal, or what is still considered monocultural or monolingual. Because something that we mentioned before is like to stop using these ideas of ni de aquí ni de allá, but it is more like de aquí y de allá. I mean, like these different belongings that we have. So I think that we can expand or extend this idea not only between the US-Mexican border, but as for other places, other context of migration. And as David mentioned before, I mean, even now in the US Mexican border, we have people from other countries. It's not only Mexicans and Americans, it is many people, okay, from different countries, from different backgrounds. So then I think that this is our intention is like to open up the conversation and to change these discourses and historical understandings and figures such as La Malinche that we have created for so many years.
Okay, la última palabra, Sue, and we'll call it a day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to all for being here, especially Angela and our authors of these great texts. I would add that being humble and knowing what kind of question to ask is part of the mission of the work that we've done. We, as Iracema hinted, we had authors who kind of said, oh God, I don't know if I can work with Anzaldua's stuff and my empirical data. And they did it beautifully. So taking the challenges of what are the robust theories that we might not even be willing to tackle because that's not what we get paid to do, right? I get my tenure and my promotion on, you know, the widgets I make in this other little factory, which might not really be, I don't know, are they making a contribution? I am convinced Anzaldúa makes a necessary contribution to all of us and to all of our scholarship. And surely there are others like indigenous wisdoms that Angela has noted here as well. So how can we pull from and orient ourselves in directions that help us ask better questions? And I think that's what our scholarship does in this book. We ask more robust questions instead of repeating the same scholarships that's already been redundified over and over. So if you're a scholar, if you're a practitioner, same thing. What are the questions you might be afraid to ask and start asking and subvert all the systems of power that we can and all the ways that we can? So that's, I think, probably my parting word. Angela, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to say here at the end. I'm grateful for all our audience and our panel participants here.
Oh, I think people might want to view this, so you'll make this available, I presume. I think that's one question.
It will be emailed to you tomorrow. And even for those who didn't come, but who signed up, they'll get a link and you can have it. And please, we invite you to share it as widely and broadly as you would like. You can Google Routledge, ROUTLEDGE, that's our publisher, applying Anzalduan Frameworks to understand transnational youth identities if you want the text. I hate the price point. I'm really sorry. I don't know what to say about the price, just the icky publishing industry that they're subject to. We don't make any money, right, Irasema?
There's a digital version that's a little more palatable, right?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
And that might be helpful for people who are in places where shipping would be,
That's right.
difficult. So you can get a digital version that might be something like affordable.
Yes. No, thank you.
Well, felicidades, you're taking it on the road. I'm sure it's going to be just very, it'll fall on very welcomed ears, just like it fell on mine. And I just wish you great success, everybody.
Thank you. Buenas noches.
Thank you very much.
Buenas noches.